Thank you. And I'd like to thank Emily and the staff of the Strand for hosting us tonight. I think probably like everyone in the room, I come here a lot and consider my patronage of the Strand to be part of my ongoing education. So it's a real pleasure to be here tonight. And I'd also like to thank Chelsea Newbold at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, who set up tonight's event. But most importantly, I'd like to welcome our guests today. We have 3 artists here who are all contributors to this year's Best American Comics 2014. I won't introduce them in detail because we're going to be looking at examples of all of their work and talking to them momentarily. So for the moment, please join me in welcoming Miriam, Katin, Raina, Telgemeier, and Lale Westvind to the stage. But before we get into the work of the individual artists who are here, I just wanted to briefly talk a little bit about the Best American Comics and the work that I've been doing on this book now for a couple of years. The Best American Comics is part of the overall Best American series published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. The oldest one, as far as I know, that's dark, is Best American Short Stories, which was founded, I looked this up, in 1915. So that's coming up on a centennial anniversary next year. Over the decades, Best American has kind of expanded to become a sort of overall umbrella title. As you can see, there are many series now under this banner, like Best American Short Stories, Best American Essays, Best American Sports Writing. The first Best American Comics was published in 2006, so this year's book is the 9th volume in the series. And like all of the other Best American titles, it has the mission of recognizing outstanding work that's published in the previous year. The way that these series work is that every series, with some exceptions, has a series editor who works on the book over a period of multiple years. And each year, that series editor works with a special guest editor. This year, the guest editor, of course, is Scott McCloud. Scott McCloud is best known for his book, Understanding Comics, a graphic novel about how comics work. And he's published other books in this vein. One's called Reinventing Comics, and others called Making Comics. He's also an author himself of fictional comics, including the all-ages comic Zot and the upcoming adult graphic novel The Sculptor that's coming out next year. So how does this work? What is the relationship between a series editor and a guest editor? Basically, my job all year round is to receive submissions. We have an open address that anyone can submit their work to, an artist or a publisher. It doesn't matter if the work comes from a large publisher or a small publisher or a self-publisher. We also accept online work. It's a very open editorial submission process. In addition to receiving and considering the work that comes in through that process, I also essentially work very hard to keep my antenna up all year round to make sure that there isn't other work out there that hasn't come in through the submissions process that we should be aware of. And inevitably, there's a lot of work that's out there that hasn't come in through the submissions process that we really ought to be aware of, because not everyone necessarily thinks to submit their work as soon as they produce it. So I do a lot of beating of the bushes, which involves going to comics festivals, talking to friends and colleagues whose opinions I respect to see if there's any work that they would recommend that I should know about, spending a lot of time on the internet, which I would never do otherwise, to look around and see what kind of work is being published or what kind of work is being talked about, and certainly as well what kind of work is simply being posted online, because a lot of people don't even publish their work in print anymore. They're just posting it on Tumblr or posting it as webcomics on a blog or in any number of other fora. So anyway, through this process, I end up accumulating hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of comics, all of which I have to read and consider. And from that pool, I get it down to a kind of pre-selection of about 100 to 130 pieces that I submit to that guest editor, in this case Scott. The guest editor then boils it down to a final list of about 30 pieces that make it into the book, also retaining the latitude to bring in a few pieces that they may have discovered on their own, of course. So that's a pretty selective book. I mean, we start out with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of comics, about 30-ish get into the book every year. So talking to Scott McCloud about this year's volume, which was my first as series editor, we kind of agreed that it would be a good idea for this year's book to present a sort of broad snapshot of where the comics field is today, for a number of reasons. One is that what was perfect about this approach is that it allowed us to kind of get both sides of Scott McCloud. Scott, like any guest editor who comes onto this project, is an engaged, critical reader who has his own tastes and preferences. But as we see from understanding comics and his other works, Scott is also a theorist, and he's able to conceptualize a very broad, non-normative map of the comics field and articulate that as well. And as a result, we have a very unique structure to this year's book. I'm guessing that that text probably looks like ants on a placemat from where you're sitting. But if you look in the book, one of the things that you'll see is that Scott has broken up the book into a number of thematic sections, which is unusual for the Best American Content, and Best American Comics. And not only has he broken it up into thematic sections, he's written short introductory texts for each one, which again is unusual. Usually the guest editor just writes one short introduction that goes at the beginning of the book, and then it's wall-to-wall comics. And the diversity of this year's volume is really striking. It includes everything, and we'll see it, of course, in the work of the panelists too. It includes everything from kids comics to more typical, quote unquote, literary comics, memoir, more experimental kind of work, and Scott has structured the book so carefully that he's further taken the unusual step of insisting in this title page at the beginning of the book that the reader read, not browse the anthology, to actually start from the beginning and read everything in order, reading his little introductory essays for each section and then moving on to the next one. I don't know how successful he'll be in this, but I do, I don't know, because I think most of us when we get anthologies, the first thing we do is maybe start flipping from the back and stop when something catches our eye. But regardless, I respect this because it is consistent with the very high level of thought and structure that Scott has brought to the book. So in that spirit, what I would like to do is talk to each of our panelists, at the very least, in the order in which they appear in the book. And I would also like to contextualize that by just sort of indicating the title of the section that Scott came up for the part of the book that their work appears in. So the first artist I'd like to talk to is Raina Telgemeier. Raina's work appears in a section called Raising Readers. It's the second section in the book. And this is, to put it in pretty broad, simple terms, a section devoted to comics for younger readers. Certainly all of the work in the book is not necessarily appropriate for younger readers, but comics for younger readers are a very important area of comics to Scott, and they're a really important area for the future of comics. You can see it written right in the title, because these are the future comics readers. Because I think there was a lot of anxiety in the comics field at a certain point that after years of arguing that comics weren't for kids anymore, we didn't actually have any comics for kids anymore. And then that's problematic if you would like to imagine a future for the field. So the work of Raina's that's in the book is an excerpt, of course, from her graphic novel Drama that was published by the graphics imprint of Scholastic Books. Raina, I was wondering if you could briefly describe Drama for the audience, in case there's anyone here who's not familiar with the work.
Sure. Oh, that's a good microphone. So Drama is a story about a group of kids on the stage crew in their middle school. And it was inspired by my days loving theater when I was in middle school and high school, in which I was always in the school musicals and plays, but I was always part of the ensemble, which is the group of kids that stands like in the background behind the leading person and like sings back up to them. And I spent a lot of time behind the scenes just kind of observing the dynamics between the actors and the stage crew and the people that make theater happen. And I was really fascinated by it. And years later, I still sort of missed that and wanted to capture that electricity that runs through the cast and crew right before the curtain goes up on opening night. How everybody's scared and everybody's excited and everybody is hoping that they won't trip or forget their lines. And I decided to focus on the stage crew because it's something that I always wanted to be a part of but never was. I never got to actually try it. But I have a lot of respect for the people who like set up the microphones and stuff before panels, because without those people, we wouldn't even be heard right now. So yeah, that was kind of what motivated me to make the characters in the stage crew. And the three characters in the story, the main characters are Callie and Jesse and Justin, who are twin brothers. They're both gay. One of them is out, one of them is not. And Callie falls for the not out one, and hilarity ensues. And this is also just kind of inspired by a relationship that I had with two gay twin brothers when I was in high school. And we're still really good friends to this day, and I sort of wanted to memorialize that friendship in a story. And so they were the first people that I showed it to when it was still in drafts, and they were like, yep, go for it. This is amazing. It's like us, but it's not really us. And the story was actually about high school kids originally, but Scholastic, after having a lot of success with my book Smile, which is aimed at middle school audiences, was kind of like, so you're a middle grade author, and it would be really amazing if you could try rewriting this story as middle school kids. And I was like, well, I can't say no until I've tried it. And I tried it, and I was happy with the result. So, and as a result, that means that I've been able to sort of keep the same fan base. I guess that's called branding, which is really awkward when you're talking about your own work like this, but it's worked out pretty well. And yeah, I'm really happy with the way it turned out in the end. And Scott was like an early supporter of the book, and it's been really awesome because of that.
Yeah, and one of the things about Best American Comics I should note too is that every author who's represented in the book submits a short bio and a short statement about the work that's in the book. And what you just said about the work is kind of related to something I wanted to ask you about, because you mentioned something in your statement about the work that including gay characters in the mix seemed to really irk a few parents. And then you noted that the book eventually won the Stonewall Book Honor, an award for LGBTQ literature. So I kind of wanted to ask you about that, because I assumed that this would probably have been an easier thing if you had done it for a high school, like with high school characters for maybe an older audience, possibly. But I'm just wondering where you think YA literature is today in terms of that kind of representation and in terms of general acceptance of that subject matter.
Well, YA literature is categorized, I think, as 13 and up.
Okay.
And middle grade is generally categorized as somewhere between 8 and 12.
Okay.
It's unclear. It depends on the book and who you're talking to at one time. But There has been a lot of YA literature with gay characters, but not that much middle grade literature with gay characters in it, and so it was just like pushing a little bit further to see if we could get away with it. And I was always really insistent that was part of the story, and that I wouldn't change that. And luckily, Scholastic was behind me 100%. But as far as parents go, some parents are sensitive, some parents aren't, some parents live in the South, some parents are really liberal. It's not one size fits all, but I think it was just, I have so many friends that have identified as gay since they were like 4 or 5 years old, that they should get to see themselves in books too, and not have to wait until they're 13 to see that.
And I suppose also speaking to issues of appropriateness, there's actually a recent interview with Scott McCloud about. Am I getting okay? There was a recent interview with Scott McCloud where he joked that this book has like a really sweetly drawn cover by Jaime Hernandez featuring a little girl, and really nice end papers that you drew that I'll show in a minute, that are kind of sweet and charming and innocent looking. But then there's a lot of work in the book that's very not for kids, including some sort of NSFW work by artists like Robert Crumb and Aileen Kaminsky-Crumb. And I think you're often presented as someone who produces work for younger readers, kind of going back to that branding thing that you were talking about. But in other contexts, you're just a cartoonist or an outstanding cartoonist among your peers who do very different kinds of work than you, like in this book. Do you find yourself having to present yourself differently or navigate things differently depending on the kind of context that you're in?
It's not something I really think about when I'm working. I just tell the stories that I want to tell. I think I'm naturally sort of prudish, though. I come from a house where my mom thought that shut up was a bad word. And she wouldn't allow us to say, oh my God, because that was like swearing. So I think for a long time, I just did stuff that I felt like I can show this to anybody and nobody will be offended by this. And it's just kind of the way I present myself as well. I went through a phase in high school where I, put swear quotes in my yearbook and made gestures at cameras and stuff. But when it came time to start drawing comics, I always felt like I wanted to be able to appeal to everybody. I guess they call that all ages, but yeah. And when I was making mini comics, I think it was just because my style was so friendly and so kid appealing. People really wanted my work to be appropriate for everybody. So I just kind of geared it towards that. Yeah, it's just kind of a natural evolution. So I don't feel uncomfortable at all among sex comics, but I don't recommend them to my readers. So when it comes to talking about other people's work, I am a little bit self-censory.
Yeah, I remember when you were, I feel like years ago, SPX with Smile was just like a mini comic or something like that, probably even before you did the Babysitters Club books. And I think it's, to me, one of the things that's really interesting is that there has been this kind of boom in, I'm probably not as conversant with the different terminology as you are, but kids comics and YA comics and the various gradations in there. That seems to be like one of the biggest growing areas of comics lately, especially within the mainstream publishing industry. And I feel like one of the differences with your work is that I feel like you got there really honestly. That was exactly the kind of work that you were doing even when you were photocopying and stapling the comics by yourself. Whereas now it seems like there are a lot of cartoonists who are like, yeah, I could do something for kids. I think that could work out. I mean, not to denigrate those people at all. I mean, there are any number of reasons why people go into any kind of work. I wanted to show, since I mentioned them before, the end papers that you drew for the book. One of the pleasures that we have working on Best American Comics is we get to pick artists who do the cover and the end papers. I showed before the cover by Jaime Hernandez. The other pleasure, of course, is seeing work in progress. These are the rough sketches that you drew for the front and back end papers, and the concept is very clear. This is the front end paper. And how would you describe the little narrative in this image? I
guess for a while now I've been listening to and contributing to this narrative about comics for girls and how a girl might not feel welcome at a place like New York Comic Con, and I was just imagining a perfect universe in which there's amazing lady creators who have lines wrapped around the convention center, and that there's a little girl that they're inspiring as well as the general public. So I just wanted to try to show a bunch of different people, and then their sort of perfect fan is waiting to meet them. I don't know if you have the last one too.
I do.
Okay. And then she's pretty inspired after that. So now she's making her own comics.
And this is, of course, drawn as black and white line art. The color balance is not so great there, but it's in a kind of two-tone color in the book. So you kind of get from the front of the book to the back of the book a kind of two-panel narrative there. So, Scott talks about this in terms of raising readers, but you're sort of presenting it too also as raising authors or raising comics creators.
That's what happened.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
I want to switch over to Miriam's work, who appears in a section called Family Tree. Scott talked about how initially, we were talking about a section that would just, be more broadly devoted to autobiography, but it happened to be the case that all of the autobiographical works that Scott really liked had something to do with family relationships, especially parent-child relationships. And the excerpt, Miriam, by you that we have in the book is from your graphic novel, Letting It Go, that was published by Drawn and Quarterly. This is the cover here, and this is an interior spread from the book that's reprinted in Best American Comics. Miriam, for those people in the audience who haven't read the book, could you explain what this is about broadly?
Okay. First of all, is it good? First of all, yes, okay. I wanted to say that I glanced through the book and I like the way it is sectioned off with the small pictures of the covers. Very important, I think. Well, basically, my book is a gigantic wedge from a mother. And letting it go, it's pretty obvious on the cover that I'm letting go a balloon that has a swastika on it. And the history of it is that I was born in 1942 in Budapest, and my mother and I, together, we survived the war in plain hiding in the countryside with false identification papers. And my first book, We Are on Our Own, which was also honored with a few pages in one of the Best American Comics. It was about the year 1944 and 45 when we escaped death by the Nazis. And so my whole life really is under this cloud of the Holocaust, although I don't remember that much, of course, being that my family, what happened to them. And the Holocaust and what happened is an everyday, unwanted, uninvited presence in my life. And stories, they beg to be told. And I always said, it was like a narrative in my mind constantly. And I said, I'm not a writer, and also who needs another Holocaust book at this point? But when I discovered for myself comics, which was about 2000, I realized that I can express myself, I can tell my stories through drawings and very little English, yes. So there it is. It's a very important part of my life, Holocaust. And after my son announced to me, after he finished SVA, he's also an artist, he announced to me he is going to live in Europe. And after a while, he told me he's going to live in Berlin, and as in Germany. And I really didn't know how to deal with that. Plus, he asked me to be able to be a Hungarian citizen, which I'm not, but because I was born there, I could give him the right to be a Hungarian citizen, which means he's an EU citizen and he can work there. well, that was over my dead body, of course. There's no way I can do that. And it took a whole year with some people talking to me that I agreed to do that. And he is a Hungarian citizen. And the book was really literary, trying to deal with the problem of how can I live with my son living in Germany, especially in Berlin. This is how it happened.
Yeah, you mentioned getting into comics around the year 2000. I think the first time I saw your work was probably in an anthology called Monkey Suit.
Yeah.
And then I started to see it here and there in a few other anthologies. I think maybe other issues of Monkey Suit. I remember an anthology called Rosetta before the first Drawn and Quarterly book came out. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your background in art, because the work was already so accomplished looking, and it seems like from what you just said that those were your first comics, but it seems like you must have been doing a lot of artwork before that.
Well, Drawn and Quarterly did my second comic ever after the first Monkeys. It was volume 4, anthology of Drawn and Quarterly. Yeah. Well, I'm not educated. I didn't even finish the first year of high school, which would have been in Hungary. After that, we went to Israel. I had never had a chance to go back to school. But I drew all the time. All my life, I can remember I was drawing, especially drawing from life. And in Israel, I was about 15. I had nothing to do. And I went to apprentice with a graphic artist, very famous graphic artist studio in Tel Aviv. I learned a lot. I went to the army. I learned there a lot too, because I begged myself into a graphic artist studio in the army, educational division, and it just continued drawing. And only when I was 63, I really didn't have a direction. Would have liked to be an illustrator, but I felt without education, maybe in education they would have guided me somewhere, but it didn't happen. So somehow I ended up doing background design for animated pictures in Israel, in New York, and I met some young people there who were comic artists who published this particular Monkey Suit, a small anthology. And this is how I started to do comics.
One of the things that's really wonderful and immediately striking about your work is that you have this in this book especially, kind of a very soft but precise colored pencil technique. All your other work that I've seen, I think, has all been drawn in graphite. You have a very free approach to page design, and I mean in a very positive way that those are wonderful hallmarks of someone coming to comics who's not so steeped in the world of comics that they only know how to do things in the conventional way. But I'm wondering how you developed, in particular, the colored pencil style of drawing that you used for this book, as opposed to the graphite, black and white, monochrome style that you used in your other comics.
I started to do proper comics with frames and the gutters and all that, and as far as the color concerned, Drawn and Quarterly were asking me when I did my first works, what about color? And I told them that the world I'm describing, the war, before the war, during the war, after the war, it comes to me always as black and gray. I can't imagine that world in color. And still there was some panels in my work that were presenting the present time, and that was in color. Now, I approached this new book. Is the first really loose one, actually, I think. I approached it, meagerly, with the boxes and this and that, and the emotions rose. I mean, I could not control myself. I really didn't have patience to do frames and boxes and start sketching it out, little sketches and writing. It just exploded, and I decided to draw without, limit. I went wilding on a paper, and this is how this happened, really. I just went free and straight, the size of the work, and it was finally flowing.
Yeah, and it really works wonderfully.
Thank you.
Part of it is that the book, in a way, it's a very emotional book. It's about a lot of competing emotions. It's also kind of a travel log, too. Like here in this spread, you're going to Lithuania, I think, on your way to Berlin. And it's just all these kind of impressions and little fragments and certain things that are kind of vague and impressionistic, and then little tiny details like the street sign that's, in very, very sharp focus and kind of jumps out from the background. So I think it's just got this kind of wonderful quality of sort of recreating for the reader the sort of sense memory.
The journey.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, some people did call it a travelogue too, and there's a lot of food in it too, which is always important. My life, everybody's life is drinking. I mean, I'm a big drinker, and so is my mother, who is 96, and it's in the book. If you ever see the whole book, it's like I have a few pages with my mother where I wanted to show the very foreignness of us, and I wrote what she said in Hungarian in script, and then I translated it in English, as we drink away our Chivas Regal there. So yes, it is loose, but I think there is also tension.
Absolutely. In your statement, you recalled that's in the book. You recalled a kind of childhood memory when your father brought you a blank book that you began drawing in, and you wrote, "It seems to me that it is this book I am still trying to fill." I was wondering if you associate drawing with childhood or memory based on that statement.
Totally. As I said, I was always drawing, and I thought it was very poignant that my father brought me that blank book, and for a long time I didn't remember it, but then I suddenly remembered how the two of us were drawing in it, and it lost, I don't know where.
I want to jump over to Lale's work. This is a kind of idiosyncratically titled section of the book. It's called, I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, the Kuiper Belt, which is the name of a belt of asteroids on the outer ring of the solar system. Scott, throughout his introductions, uses this kind of metaphor, kind of like he's, Carl Sagan in the Mind Ship, taking us to, exploring the universe of comics. And this is a kind of interesting section of work that he perceives as being kind of pushing the edge of form, pushing the edge of style. A lot of it also kind of under the radar too. And one of the things about this section is that it's got a lot more pieces than many of the other sections, but they're a lot shorter too. And talking to Scott, his rationale for that was that he wanted to give the readers a kind of high impact sense of the huge range of work that's out there that's kind of pushing against the limits of comics, and also in many cases outside of the awareness of the general reader. So we have a lot of these very short sections of work by a variety of readers. So Lale, this is your comic Hyperspeed to Nowhere #2 that we run an excerpt of in the book. And this is something that you published yourself. This is a self-published work in full color. These are the pages that are in the Best American Comics. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about this story or what this series Hyperspeed to Nowhere is about.
Hello? I've always liked science fiction because with my comics and with my drawing, the goal is almost, I want to be having as much fun drawing it the whole time. I don't want to be bored at all, if possible. So science fiction kind of gives the most opportunity to draw the wildest things. and have the wildest ideas. I think a lot of my comics, even if they're not exactly science fiction, the idea is to the weirdest thing I can come up with that maybe I haven't heard anything like it before, if that's even possible, but as close to that as I can get, and then make that happen. So this series, the first book is actually just 4 or 5 short stories that are sort of in the sci-fi genre, but that's sort of like a catch-all thing, I think. And the series is going to function as a sort of like a intergalactic travelogue, where it kind of picks up on different characters and planets, and then it'll shift to another species or something. And the second book is really where the story starts, and it's 44 pages or 48. And at the end, the main characters are kind of floating through space in these energy fields or something. There's actually a reference to a Fletcher Hanks panel. So they're just like gone in space, and then it kind of the next book is going to focus on the creatures that are on the planet below them. That's yeah.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned science fiction, and in your statement that's in the book, you talk about science fiction, but you also relate it to your personal experience. You talk about how these characters are using a will box in which the technology is kind of responding to their will, and you point out that you felt like you had a similar kind of situation when you were driving cross country on a motorcycle, and you felt like a lot of your attitude, the functioning of the machine almost depended on your attitude. Do you think of science fiction as a good way, beyond like coming up with stuff that you're really excited to draw, is it a good way to process your personal experience?
Yeah, and also my personal developing spiritual viewpoint, which is the power of thought, or your effect, or the effect of your thoughts on your reality, and taking that to the furthest point, really. And I find a lot of that in kind of new age science fiction from the 70s and the 60s, and obviously we know where that comes from or what they were doing. But I also think that the limits of science fiction, the apex, will be it's not so much technology as really thought. I mean, you can see it now sort of, if you look at the newest interfaces with computers, it's the more intuitive it becomes, that's kind of the more modern. So if you can take that to the furthest point, the most evolved version of technology would be thought-based. So there is no physical, so it's related to that, I think. Mm-hmm. But yeah, the motorcycle thing, I was on a motorcycle for 6 months or something, and when you're relying on any technology for that long, you tend to give it kind of character. It becomes a person, sort of. Yeah, and you do find that if you're in a bad mood, it won't start, or you have to talk to it to get things like, and it's all in your head, and then it isn't. There's no way of proving that, or.
And also the will box reminded me of the mother box from Jack Kirby comics. You mentioned like reading like new age sci-fi literature. Do you read those kinds of like sci-fi comics or old superhero comics?
I actually have very recently only learned who Jack Kirby was, kind of. And I never read comics I read Tintin, but comics, I never read them. I'd flip through them, and I liked the pictures a lot, but I still barely read my comics. I think I don't have the patience. Mm-hmm. So I actually maybe have never read any Jack Kirby comics. Mm-hmm. I've seen some panels on the internet that look great.
Yeah. Well, what's so interesting too is like you mentioned that you don't have this, and this is like I think a really, and kind of like I was saying about Miriam, that she doesn't come from this hardcore comics mindset. I think it's kind of a nice thing about the current world of comics is that there are a lot of people who are entering the field who didn't grow up only reading comics or only copying comics, but have other kinds of experience too. And I know that you make animation, and on your website, you have a lot of like older paintings that are on there. I don't know if you still paint, but you're also like a really talented painter. I'm wondering what appeals to you about comics as a form specifically.
They're more fun than painting. Painting, I love painting, but it was also extremely painful and literally toxic because I was using oils, and they were very studious kind of traditional paintings, which I love doing, but a lot of people are like, oh, who cares? What is, so people like my comics. It shouldn't be the reason to do anything. It's not, but that's definitely encouraging. And just the fact that it's cheap and you can show it to a lot of people, and I also feel like instead of laboring over this one image, I'm making thousands of images, and I kind of work that way in my I like making every panel this exciting thing. I don't like making blank panels, even for pacing or anything. I hate that. But so yeah, it's like faster painting. And we're all going to die soon. So there's no sense to make paintings, maybe.
Well, yeah, that populist aspect too, about making it fast and getting it out to a lot of people, is worth noting too. And one of the big differences between you and the other panelists here, actually, is that I don't think we can find your work at the Strand, because you self-publish, and you self-publish in formats that don't conform to the sort of preferences and standards of the bookstore market. You're making, small runs of like 40-page or 44-page staple-bound comics like this one, but they're really dense and full of great art. What are the challenges and rewards of that kind of self-publishing for you?
So the reward is that I don't have to make any compromises whatsoever. I don't need to explain myself to anybody. I always have that thing where I'm trying to realize, like, oh, I'm publishing this. I could put absolutely anything in this book. Trying to unlimit myself all the time. And then the challenges are that it's an expensive hobby, and I think people, it might be in a more book form soon, the collections of the smaller works, but yeah, it's great to make your own. I hope that everybody in this room, if you aren't self-publishing something already, that you start. And it doesn't have to be printed, even just making a website or whatever.
I know you have published at least a couple of issues of an anthology called Chromozoid that includes work by other artists. Do you feel like your work has benefited from access to a kind of community of other people who are doing this kind of self-publishing work?
Yeah. It's very encouraging and nice having peers. I think I moved to Chicago for school, and then I came back, and I felt like I didn't know anybody anymore. Everyone had left, sort of, who I knew in high school, I guess. And now everybody that I know in New York is comics related. So it gave me a new group of people, and it's always, it's not competitive, but at least it's, someone else is working on something, so you better be working as well, or I don't know.
Just to give a little bit more sense of the range in the book, I wanted to show some slides of some people who aren't on the panel. One of the things all of our panelists have in common, of course, is that they live in and around New York City and are available to come here today. So just as an organizing principle, I've included some images by some other artists who also live in New York but who weren't able to participate in today's panel. Ben Catchor, for example, we have a couple of examples of his work. Some of you may be familiar with Ben's work. He has several books out, mostly through Pantheon, but this is from a series of one-page comics that he draws for Metropolis magazine, which is a kind of architecture magazine, and these are all on the subject of urbanism. Aidan Koch did a 4-page, she just moved to New York, did a 4-page story that's in the book called Blue Period, and this was in Sonatina #2, which is a very small press anthology. This 4-page story, I don't know if anyone saw it, was published on the Huffington Post yesterday as an excerpt from this volume of Best American Comics. Jeff Duncanson has 2 pages in the book in the same section that's about style and form taken to the limits. And these comics, is Jeff here today? Who's supposed to? Oh, hey, Jeff. Hey. These comics were only published, before they were published in Best American Comics, as far as I know, they were only published on Tumblr. And that's work that I saw just looking around on the internet and seeing people very frequently reblogging these images on Tumblr and thinking that they were very strong. So that's the kind of thing that I was able to find myself just by going out on the internet and keeping my eyes open and seeing what people were posting. Of course, it also helped that Jeff probably posted something like 200 pages of comics over the course of the year, so it was kind of like this fire hose of really beautiful pages that you couldn't miss if you were on the internet at all. Mark Siegel, who is the editor of First Second, the graphic novel imprint of Macmillan, wrote and drew a graphic novel called Sailor Twain, also published by First Second, and we included an excerpt from that book. And Adrian Tomine produced a really beautiful story called Translated from the Japanese. This appeared in a staple-bound comic book, Optic Nerve number 13, published by Drawn and Quarterly. I think Adrian, because he's so successful and popular, is probably the only person who could talk Drawn and Quarterly into publishing a staple-bound comic book these days now, because they're almost entirely have moved over to the book format. But this, if anyone hasn't seen it, and we include the story in full in Best American Comics, is a really beautiful story. And if you've seen Adrian's illustrations for the New Yorker, either on the cover of the magazine or in the interior of the magazine, the images here are actually a lot closer to those single illustrations than they are his standard comic book sequences. And it's this really interesting piece where there's this text running through it that reads as if it's from a letter. It's not clear really if it's from someone Adrian knows, or if it's something he found, or if it's just something that he invented. And this text is kind of running through with all of these single images that look like illustrations. And even the illustrations themselves are specific enough that they look like they relate to the text, but a little bit non-specific too. So it almost feels like a collection of found images attached to a found text to produce a really meaningful and beautiful piece of work. So these are just a few of the, I think, 34 stories that are in Best American Comics. The other thing I wanted to just put up on the screen, in case anyone in the room is an artist or a publisher, this is our address. You can find it on the website. Please submit your work, and please do it all year round as you publish stuff, because we get a lot of stuff at the end of our reading period, and it's really great to get things throughout the year when we actually have time to read and consider it with the time and thoughtfulness that we would like to. And with that, I would like to open the floor for questions. We only have a few minutes left, I think, but if anybody has any questions for any of the panelists about their work, you probably had your fill of hearing about the Best American Comics, but if anyone still has a question about that, I'm happy to answer it. But we can take a question. You can direct it to the panel or to any of the artists individually if anyone would like to ask them about their work a little bit. Anyone? And no? 1, 2, 3? No. Okay. And if not, then please join me in thanking them all for being here today.
Yeah.